You're listening to the Onside Podcast, the podcast for innovation-driven entrepreneurship here in Atlantic Canada. I'm your host, Alex McCann, and this is Season 2, Episode 18, and our theme is the nature of place in fostering innovation. Today, our guest is Jen Angel, the CEO of Evergreen. She's a builder of community, momentum, and places that people love. Together with partners, Jen builds inclusive, sustainable places that attract people and investment, enhance resilience, and contribute to the well-being for all. In 2021, Jen was recognized as one of Atlantic Business Magazine's top 50 CEOs and the most powerful woman in Atlantic Canada in 2022. She recently received the Inaugural Wije'winen Allyship Award in 2022 from the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center. She is a co-founder of the annual Art of City Building Conference, bringing placemaking leaders from around the world to Halifax. Jen, welcome to the show. I'm so glad to have you here on the Onside Podcast. We've been wanting to have you for a while, so welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's such a thrill to be here.
Awesome. Well, I think we could probably start off with getting to know you a little bit better. Who is Jen Angel? What are you up to?
So, who is Jen Angel? I am a champion of Nova Scotia. Mm-hmm. I was born here. I grew up in Dartmouth. I was born at the Grace 1,000 years ago. And I have spent most of my career in Halifax. I went to school here. I went to King's, and then I went to Dell, and then I went to SMU.
Oh, you got them all.
Yeah, I got a few of them anyway. Uh-huh. There's a few left. I studied philosophy in my undergraduate, and then did an MBA in marketing. And sort of along the way, I worked in real estate while I was going to school. My dad was involved in the industry, and so sort of my side hustle. Mm-hmm. And I guess you could say now sort of the philosophy and the marketing and the real estate have kind of converged in the work I'm doing around place.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I lead an organization called Evergreen, based in Toronto, but with a national mandate to build a better future through better public spaces. Before that, I was working with Develop Nova Scotia here in Halifax to contribute to the magnetism of Nova Scotia to attract people, an economic development crown corporation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I have a little side question. We're gonna talk about sort of the nature of place and placemaking. Yeah. But how did you go from philosophy to marketing to real estate? Like, how did that? You know, were you deep into, Socrates or deep thinker?
No.
Like, how did that happen?
No, I started in philosophy with a plan to go to law school. Mm. And then at that sort of decision juncture after finishing my undergrad, I went business instead. And the real estate was sort of unrelated. Again, I sort of started working in real estate when I was pretty young because my dad was selling it and I was sort of supporting him on the side. And in the end, it sort of all came together in an unexpected way. Interesting. I'm always curious about people who study philosophy and kind of like the journey. Yeah. I did an undergrad in anthropology. And so people are always like, anthropology? It's like one of those weird kind of... But has so many applications beyond, right? My friends who are supporters of this philosophy undergrad would say it's about exercising your brain, and has lots of different applications as a result. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it was an interesting few years for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, having known you a bit, I feel like maybe this did impact kind of your way of thinking or caring about things. So that's kind of interesting. Well, why don't we jump in a little bit because I'm really curious about. We've talked in the past, in the real world, I guess, not in the podcast, but about place and the nature of place. And you've talked a lot through your work here in Nova Scotia at Develop and with your new role at Evergreen, a little bit about place. But what is placemaking? Like, what the heck does that mean? For people who are in the audience who are like, okay, placemaking, I don't really get it. What is placemaking?
Yeah, it's sort of cool these days to talk about placemaking. It's really, really simple. Place is really the built environment and related program that centers people. So it's an effort to make spaces more livable and inclusive, and I would say in my work harder to serve the outcomes you're trying to serve. And, for a long time we've built infrastructure, for example, focused on automobiles. And the idea of centering people in place kind of just wasn't what you did. And so the social infrastructure, things like public spaces, were the things you spent money on when there was money left over from building highways. It was sort of the soft and fluffy stuff. And there's never money left over from building highways. So it really was not prioritized. And I think now what we're recognizing is that public places where diverse people feel welcome to come together and get to know each other, has a really critical influence on how we live and who gets to participate. The other thing I would say about place is that it's almost less about the thing you build and more about how you build it. So it's a process as much as it is an outcome, and it's really about bringing people together to plan together, to work through challenging conversations and problems together. And it's through that activity of working together that the real benefits emerge.
Well, it's so interesting. I think a few years ago, I had not even really heard that term, sort of placemaking, and really thinking about it. And I'm in a book club, and I guess luckily one of my book club members is an architect.
Nice.
And we had to read Jane Jacobs.
Yes.
I have to tell you, that was a really hard book
Yeah.
to get through. But she has a lot of interesting commentary on how cities are built, or where roads are, or the process of involving people in the structure and the nature of the built environment, as you kind of described it. Are there some things that have influenced your thinking about how places are made, or what's important about how places are made?
Yeah. So actually, Jane Jacobs is credited with a quote that I actually have used in lots of decks over the years. And that's roughly, you can only have places for everybody when you build them with everybody. And I think in context, it was really talking about the building of cities is not something that's relegated to architects and planners. And in fact, I think oftentimes that focus is on the building, and the public space is sort of the negative space. It's the leftover space. And my work is really focused on centering the public space and thinking of the buildings and the backdrop. And so when you design for people first, you look at things differently. And the Project for Public Spaces, a group started by Fred Kent many years ago, I think he started it in New York City, has really helped to reframe how we look at the public realm, the built environment, and the role it plays. So again, I think it's about centering people in infrastructure, and it's also about centering public space or prioritizing public space. It's sort of a platform for democracy and for people, as I said, all people, if you do it well, to come together and be able to participate. And it has a very meaningful impact on how we live, how we move around, who gets to participate, whether they see themselves in the environment or don't, has a very meaningful impact on belonging. Whether we're building areas that are extractive or regenerative in terms of the environment, and whether, and we've talked about this before too, Alex, like, are there barriers to participation? And so, the traditional architect or planner, particularly as positions of privilege, they aren't proxies for community. And so it's part of the beauty of placemaking is that when it's done well, and we are intentional about bringing diverse people together with different lived experiences, they then get to influence the spaces that are built and can ensure that because they've had a hand in building them, they're places where they can participate and belong, and really participate and belong.
I think I'm really enjoying listening to hear what you're saying, and it's making me think of so many things. But I just, when you're talking about that engagement in the public space and how that space sort of comes together, I find that really interesting. When I first moved to Halifax, so I was living in Washington, D.C., in a city about 2 blocks away from a metro station. I could walk to the Smithsonian probably in like 20 minutes. Really kind of urban environment. And when I moved to Halifax, I moved to a much more residential neighborhood. And I hadn't really thought about it until we moved to our neighborhood. But I realized once I got there, I was like, oh, there's no sidewalk here. And I was kind of new. And I was like, oh, this is weird. There's like no sidewalk. I can't like walk my dog on the sidewalk. And in Washington, I was used to just walking on the sidewalk. I'd run into people or see people at the dog park or something like that. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then I realized, oh, okay, there's no sidewalk. Well, I guess there's nowhere to walk to. I was like, I can't walk to the grocery store or, all of these things. And I started to become much more aware of kind of how I was living in a different place and how I would interact and how would I meet people in this kind of sort of new environment. And the other thing I'm hearing is I think maybe there's been a shift. I certainly in the past would think about, architects and builders and planners and urban designers, but I would think of them as like designing the really cool building.
Yeah.
I didn't really I was like, oh, wow, that's an amazing skyscraper or cool house. I hadn't really thought about the space around there where we have that intersection. So it is kind of interesting to think about or take a moment to think about how you actually interact in the space kind of around you.
Well, and I think at this moment, as we're dealing with, for example, across the country, a crisis of homelessness and also just a lack of affordable housing, we're making very large investments in housing and infrastructure. That we are thoughtful about how those investments are made, that we're building where there are amenities like some of the ones you described, that we're concentrating on infill in cities rather than, sprawl and greenfield development where those amenities don't exist and transportation may not be sufficient, I think is a really important thing. And there's a risk always with urgency, as there is around the housing issue, that we, under cover of urgency, move fast, but don't necessarily think it sufficiently through. And so part of what we're advocating is that this is exactly the moment to be thoughtful. This infrastructure we're investing in, is 50-year infrastructure. And it has a great deal of power to shape the way we live. So we know how to build better places. We know how to build regenerative infrastructure. We know how to build accessible places. Let's make sure, and in a way that, again, contributes to the planet rather than contributes to the problems that are destroying the planet. So we have a responsibility now not to choose between going fast and being thoughtful, which is a false choice, but to do both.
Yeah. I think that's so well said. Here in Halifax, we're talking about the Cogswell Interchange and the legacy that left in terms of creating a dead zone basically in the city. And that's 50-year infrastructure, as you said. So we have to be really thinking about where we put things, how we make it accessible, what are the amenities, how are people going to live with the things that we're putting up. And Halifax is growing so quickly in the last few years. Well, one of the things we've also been talking about at Onside and we're thinking about because we're focused on kind of inclusive innovation and entrepreneurship. And something I've been trying to think about, especially since the pandemic in particular, has really changed the way I think about it. And I think a lot of people think about space and where you are and where you work and live and, and some of those kinds of ideas. Has the pandemic influenced the way you think about space, particularly around how we create spaces for innovation and entrepreneurs? Because we want to make sure we have those drivers, those collisions, and all those kinds of things. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say two things. The first is that I think it helped to show the importance of public spaces. When we weren't able to gather indoors, the sidewalk, the park, the public realm became a place of recreation, of
safety.
Yeah, absolutely. Of reprieve for many folks, like an ability to get out of the house and get some fresh air and, do the thing. So I think we began to sort of, it also, I'll just add to that, it became expanded patios for businesses who were suffering on main streets. It became, a place to say hello and get to connect with the world and combat some of the social isolation and related mental health impacts that the pandemic was having. But I would say, sort of more broadly, I think, and Halifax has experienced this acutely, people are increasingly seeking quality of life. And with some of the technology that emerged through the pandemic, we are now much more able to work from anywhere. And when you can work from anywhere and companies and jobs follow talent, you have a lot of agency and choice as an individual employee. And so I think that it's opened up for Nova Scotia and Halifax a real opportunity in that it is building on sort of a quality of life advantage that already existed to attract diverse talent here and build a density of talent. And I think in general, it's elevating the importance of public realm and public spaces and city building in general as a competitive advantage that can't be overlooked in a global competition for talent, which of course are the building blocks of innovation and economy.
That's so interesting. And I think that is really insightful because I think, this is a few years ago. I remember looking at something about Iceland. And, a lot of people are like, oh, Iceland, Reykjavik, it's cold. Why would anybody live there? Sorry, people from Iceland. I think it's a wonderful place. But they really invested in fostering their culture. So a lot of music, culture, focus on volcanoes and ice and all this kind of stuff. And then suddenly Iceland became hot. Like it became this cool place and people want to go to Iceland and check it out. You can fly on Iceland Air and get the stopovers and these kinds of things. And so focusing on what makes you special or what's interesting for you, I think that really does drive a lot of interesting talent. So, now there's a lot of banking, finance, tech folks that are in Iceland amongst other people who make really great sweaters, because it's so cold. And here in Halifax, we have some interesting places like Volta or other kinds of kind of accelerator or tech places. Do you think we're doing pretty good with those places? Like, is there anything that would help make them more attractive or inclusive from like a design kind of perspective? Or
I think it's less about sort of, is it pretty enough? And I'm glad you raised Iceland, and I think Copenhagen has done some interesting things in regenerative tourism too, in particular, which extends, frankly, to attracting people writ large. Tourists are just short-term residents. And I think the point is people are more socially aware, I think, than they have been for a long time, and they're making decisions about places, whether to visit or to live, in part based on the leadership that's shown and the types of investments made. So I would say, for example, what we decide to do as it relates to climate, how we're investing in or prioritizing regenerative infrastructure, regenerative policy, says a lot about the place that we are. And I think it will increasingly be clear that people will go where they see leadership in these areas of social justice and environmental justice. And I think in a way that we haven't seen before. So when I'm thinking about like a Volta or a Cove, and of course in my former role we were involved in the creation of the Center for Ocean Ventures and Entrepreneurship, I think it's about continually thinking about how to push the boundaries of the infrastructure. So not just the physical bricks and mortar, but also the program that knits it together, and thinking about how to make those things work harder for more people, in particular people who have been left out before, and also for the planet. Like, because every decision, for example, in infrastructure, was the space I work in, every decision can be regenerative or not. And so if we're that granular and that deliberate and intentional about putting an environmental and a social justice lens on these very traditional infrastructure related sectors, then I think we can have a really meaningful impact, not only on the quality of what's built, but on its relative magnetism to attract people here, which is the goal.
Yeah, I think that's so. Well, I feel like pandemic notwithstanding, we have been able to attract people over the last couple of, and I think that did have a lot to do with the way we handled things, the leadership, things that were going, and things you were doing, in your previous role around creating outdoor places and spaces where people could go and spend time, whether it's waterfront. And I do think that we did see an influx of remote workers or people moving from Toronto, the U.S., who realize we have a really good quality of life here. Things are relatively safe. And I can do my banking job from Halifax and, work in New York or other places like that. So I think we'll hopefully see that trend kind of continue. And we'll keep creating that place that is magnetic. That's what I think of. I think we're creating like a magnetic place. Yeah.
Irresistible.
Yeah, irresistible, magnetic. Today it's a little cold, but
it's a little cold.
A little still magnetic. You just have to be well apportioned with your clothing.
Absolutely.
You'll be fine.
No such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing.
Exactly.
My old mentor used to say.
My grandmother is 99 years old, and she says, "A lady never makes any excuse for the weather. You just dress appropriately." And I always think of that.
Well said. Well said.
I feel like if she's 99, she knows what she's talking about.
She's got something. Yep.
Yeah. Well, another thing we've talked about in the past, and you've kind of alluded to it kind of in some of your opening comments, was around the role of community and how community has the opportunity to get involved, or in the work that you're leading, that you're trying to create space for community to get involved. Can you talk a little bit about that more? And then maybe do you have an example of, where you've seen that work well or how it could work better?
Yeah. So we have always built places notionally with community. So we'd host open houses as part of the process of planning for a new development. And inevitably the same few, mostly white, mostly male, mostly professionals would show up. And they contributed a lot, and if happy they came, because if they didn't come, it would be a very lonely open house. But we would go ahead and then build a project anyway. So to check the box, we did the open house. Everybody was invited-ish. We'll build the thing anyway. And it's not only left a lot on the table, but I would even contend, and I think if you look closely at the cities built, 50 years ago or whatever, we were baking into the landscape particular points of view. That seems a bit esoteric, but I believe it to be true. And so talking about systemic racism, I think it has a thread in the built environment. And so we began probably 5 or so years ago with my former colleagues to rethink how we did engagement. And I think it's come a long way because there's a recognition that you can't just create a spot that you're comfortable hosting and expect that it will be comfortable for others to participate there. So you need to be deliberate about meeting community where they're comfortable. And I would say we're beginning to do that better, but there's still a lot of opportunity around acknowledging that relationship needs to be reciprocal. It's not about sort of parachuting in to community when you need them on your time scale to extract what they know. And this is emotional labor, and particularly racialized communities are being asked again and again and again, because all of these white people are suddenly realizing, oh my God, like people have been left out. But it can't be an extractive relationship. It has to be reciprocal. And it requires, just like any relationship, a development of trust, an ability to see some benefit to community, to participation. And that takes time and intention. And I think there's still a lot of work to do. But I also believe if we get it right, we will create much better places where many more people will feel a sense of belonging. And when we're thinking about this in the context of innovation, again, the sort of magic goal is that we're able to create these really diverse places with really diverse people with different ideas about the world, different lived experiences. And when you talk about collisions, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, that's when they're really interesting, when there's different points of view that begin to come together. I've heard it said that innovation is not about like a eureka moment. It's not about just a light bulb moment. It starts often with that's interesting, like, that's unusual. And I think there's a greater possibility of that happening when you have things you haven't seen before, or things you have, looking at things in a way you haven't done before, which to my mind has to be encouraged through being with people with different experiences than you've had.
Yeah. And that's something I think when the pandemic hit, we were really missing that opportunity. We all kind of retreated back into our silos a little bit, at least in the physical world.
Yeah. In your neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Where a lot of people like you live.
Yeah. Yeah. We were kind of stuck, and it was challenging. I think we had to rise to the occasion. That we didn't have a choice for 2 years to figure out how to connect kind of in a virtual environment. But I'm glad we're kind of mostly back in person and trying to have those engagements and create those opportunities for collisions, because I think that I feel like a lot of creative energy was unleashed during the pandemic in a kind of new way. And I think with our opportunity to kind of, I don't know if I'm going to go into the metaverse, but opportunity to be in the real world and the virtual world. And I think we'll probably start to see some interesting kind of collisions. And there were, interestingly, opportunities for people who couldn't participate otherwise. If you're disabled or things like that, when things were virtual, made it a little bit easier. But at the same time, also not easier for people who don't have access to internet.
Well, and I think social isolation is a real issue. Like, I think there's a mental health crisis that's also happening. There's a crisis of eroding social capital and polarization. And again, I think if we can't solve that stuff, then the other stuff is impossible to solve, because it's going to take all of us working together. And I'm really concerned about this, populism that we're beginning to see, polarization. It's going the wrong way. And I actually think public spaces can help solve for that too. The other thing I would just mention when we're thinking about innovation through the pandemic and its relationship to public space is, having worked in a Crown corporation at that time, I was really struck by how quickly government was able to move when lives depended on it. So you saw things like patios being extended and new bike lanes being created, even with temporary infrastructure. And these were things that never before could be done quickly, or at least that was the belief. And so I really hope that, I'm now not in government, I really hope that we don't lose that, because it's easy to lean back on bureaucracy as or complexity as a reason not to do things. And we know now, we've shown now, we can do hard things when we prioritize them. Or maybe things aren't as hard as we think they are, and we need to be prioritizing the things, again, that sort of center people.
Well, that's a perfect little segue, because my next question for you was around what kind of projects are interesting to you right now? Or is there something that's sort of going on now that you think is really interesting in that area?
Yeah, so one project at Evergreen, where I am now, is thinking about school grounds as underutilized public spaces that can work a lot harder for community and also for the environment. So they're in every community. They're often asphalt. Sometimes they're relics of the 60s or 70s. And there's so we just launched Canada's first climate-ready school in a suburb outside of Toronto at a school called Irma Coulson. And it's about rethinking the possibility of public space around a school to deal with stormwater runoff. So it's a sponge, basically, to maximize tree canopy, so it's green and regenerative, and to introduce all sorts of nature-based play into the grounds. And it's attractive not just to kids, but to families in the neighborhood. And by involving the kids in the planning, they've created the space where they see themselves.
Cool.
And I happened to be there for the opening day, and it was extraordinary. And it's like this outdoor, green space with outdoor play equipment or whatever, but it's the thoughtfulness and the intention put to the infrastructure that has changed it from what could have been, a swing set on a soccer field that, if you grew up in the 70s and 80s as I did, was always a mud puddle, right? Just something that's actually helping to mitigate against the effects of climate change and even regenerate, as well as, to use your language, be a magnet for community to come together.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds fantastic. I'm just, as you're talking, I'm just reminiscing about my kids in elementary school and the teachers' parking lot, which is like always just like gravelly and asphalt and all that, and would just like be full of puddles and holes. And then the soccer field, which is basically like, I don't know what, it was like this pile of dirt and mud, and it needed some work.
Yeah.
And I think that's really great because young people are concerned about climate. It's a great place to get educated, have like real world experiences, get off of technology for a few minutes on the playground and reconnect with your body and your space, get good mental health and physical activity. And I think that's so important, especially for kids nowadays. They're really missing out on some of those kinds of opportunities.
And again, to the sort of discussion about like eroding social capital, we need kids to work with we need all humans, but let's start with kids even, to work together through problems. I mean, we need to be able to talk to each other. And I think, social media has made it easier not to do that and to double down on, extreme positions in service of getting likes and getting, amplification of our posts, and alienated some of those more, balanced points of view in some cases. And I really do think it is the thing we should be talking more about. This, how do we rebuild social capital? How do we work together? How do we create the conditions for collaboration and problem solving? Because we need them. Like, we have a convergence of very large, very complex problems to solve, and the first step is to figure out how to get along and work together to solve them.
Well, I don't know if we're going to tackle all of those problems today or solve all of those problems, but I think you've raised them and you've put the challenge out there. So hopefully our listeners are hearing that call. Last little question we like to ask kind of our guests, and I might change it just a little bit because we usually ask our guests, what does innovation-based entrepreneurship mean to you? I might say that, or is there anything around innovation-based placemaking? Like, what would one of those mean to you?
Yeah, so when I think about innovation-driven entrepreneurship, to me, it's bigger than sort of, it's about scalability. And so I would suggest that what's scalable about place is not create a model and then do the same thing in other places. Like, it's not create a plan and then do that plan elsewhere. It's about sort of ingredients that make a place great, that are more generic and hyper-local. So it's like a process that can be kind of codified and then used in other places. And fundamental, I think, is a willingness to take risks, a deliberate and intentional engagement of community, as we've just talked about, including and especially communities that haven't participated before or wouldn't naturally see themselves in a place. And it's an appreciation that this is 50-year, 100-year infrastructure. So there's a huge stakes in getting it right. So, making the commitment to build infrastructure that is giving something back versus taking something away. Yeah, so I think it's more about the sort of codifying the process to build great places rather than designing something and then duplicating it in other places.
I love that. Well, that is fantastic. I appreciate all your insights that you shared with us today. If folks want to learn more about you or your work, or how can people connect with you and learn more?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm on Twitter, but I think I have 3.5 followers or something. Jen Angel NS. I'm also on LinkedIn. And they can reach out to me anytime, jangel@evergreen.ca. I always love to talk to people about this work or other things that others are thinking about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That sounds fantastic. And so thank you for joining us. And for our listeners, I appreciate if you could like and subscribe to our podcast. And you can also learn more about Onsite and our Inclusive Innovation Monitor on our website, which is onsitenow.ca. And as we come to a close, I'd really like to thank Communities, Culture, and Heritage for your support. We're so grateful for your support in helping us make this podcast. And look forward to having you tune in next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alex.
This
has been
a Podstarter
production.